The morning I found the note, the sky over Knoxville was the color of old pewter, flat and heavy, the way it gets in early March when winter hasn't quite decided to let go. I had driven myself to the pharmacy on Merchants Drive, the one near the intersection where they put up that new traffic light nobody asked for. My daughter-in-law, Renee, had offered to come with me. She always offered lately, always hovering, always smiling, that smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I told her I was fine. I told her I preferred to go alone. I was 63 years old. I had raised 2 children, buried a husband, and kept 40 acres of Tennessee farmland running for 31 years. I did not need someone to hold my hand at the pharmacy. The waiting area had 4 chairs and a small table with magazines nobody read. I sat down with my prescription slip and my purse on my lap, and I watched the second hand on the wall clock move the way it always does when you're waiting, slower than it has any right to. That was when the woman sat down beside me. She was older than me by at least 10 years, small-framed, with white hair cut close to her head, and the kind of careful, deliberate posture that told me she had once been a person of some authority. A teacher, maybe, or a nurse. She wore a gray coat with small pearl buttons, and she carried a canvas bag printed with the logo of the public library 2 towns over. She did not look at me right away. She looked at her hands. Then she said, quietly, without turning her head, "You're Margaret Hollis." I said yes. I said it the way you say it when you're not sure if you should. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a small envelope, the kind that comes with a greeting card, cream-colored, sealed. She held it out toward me without ceremony, the way you'd hand someone a pen. "Don't open it here," she said, "and don't mention it to your son or his wife." I looked at the envelope. I looked at her. "Who are you?" I asked. She finally turned and looked at me directly. Her eyes were gray and steady and completely without panic. "Someone who knew your husband," she said. "Someone he trusted. My husband Gerald had been gone for 14 months. Heart attack, the doctor said. Sudden. He had been out checking the fence line on the north side of the property on a cold January morning, and by the time I saw him from the kitchen window and understood that something was wrong, there was already nothing anyone could do. I had not finished grieving him. I was not sure I had started. "Gerald never mentioned you," I said. "No," she said simply. "He wouldn't have." Before I could say anything else, the pharmacy technician called my name from the counter, and when I looked back, the woman was already standing, pulling her coat straight, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. "My name is Dorothy," she said. "If you decide you want to talk, my number is inside. But read it tonight. Don't wait." And then she walked out through the glass doors and into the gray morning, and I sat there with a cream-colored envelope in my hand, and my heart beating in a way I could not entirely explain. I put the envelope in my purse, beneath my wallet, beneath my checkbook, beneath the folded grocery list I had been carrying for a week. I put it deep and I drove home, and I did not think about it. That is what I told myself. In truth, I thought about nothing else. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long gravel drive, surrounded by fields that Gerald's grandfather had first broken in 1941. The house itself was white clapboard, 2 stories, with a porch that wrapped around the front and one side. Gerald had repainted it the summer before he died. I used to tease him that he chose the hottest week of July on purpose, just to have something to complain about. My son Daniel and his wife Renee had been staying with me since Gerald passed. Daniel said it was because he was worried about me being alone. Renee said the same things Daniel said, always half a second later, like an echo that had learned to smile. They had moved into the 2 rooms on the east side of the house, the guest room and the small sitting room adjacent to it that Gerald had used as a study. Renee had quietly moved Gerald's books to the hallway within the first 2 weeks. She said she was reorganizing. I did not argue. I was too tired to argue, and I told myself it did not matter. But it did matter. Everything was beginning to matter in a way I had not expected. 3 weeks after Gerald died, Daniel had come to me with papers. An estate management proposal, he called it. A way to consolidate the farm's assets and simplify the trust structure. He had a lawyer with him, a young man I had never met who wore a tie that was slightly too short and kept clicking his pen. Daniel said it was just modernizing things, just making sure everything was protected, just looking out for me. I did not sign. I told him I wanted my own lawyer to look it over first. Daniel said that was fine. He said, of course. He said he just wanted what was best for me. Renee made pot roast that evening and said nothing at the dinner table, but I noticed she refilled Daniel's water glass and not mine. Small things. That was how it started. Small things that I catalogued in the back of my mind, the way you catalog weather changes when you've lived close to the land long enough. Not with alarm, just with attention, just with the quiet understanding that something is shifting. That night, after Daniel and Renee had gone to their rooms and the house was dark and the clock in the hallway said 9:10, I sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and I took the envelope out of my purse. My name was written on the front in handwriting I did not recognize. Careful, unhurried. The letters slightly old-fashioned in the way of someone who had learned penmanship before it stopped being taught. I opened it. Inside were two things. A folded piece of notepaper and a small brass key. The notepaper said, "Margaret, Gerald loved you more than you probably knew he was capable of saying. He also knew things about Daniel and Renee that he was trying to verify before he brought them to you. He did not want to hurt you with suspicion alone. He wanted to come to you with proof." He ran out of time. The key belongs to a lockbox at the First Heritage Bank on Sutton Road. Box number 114. Gerald put it in my keeping because he was afraid the house wasn't safe. Go alone. Go soon. I am sorry to be the one to do this. Dorothy. I read it twice. Then I set it down on the table and looked at the kitchen around me. The copper pots hanging above the stove that I had bought at an estate sale in 1987. The curtains with the small blue flowers that had been there so long I no longer saw them. The crack along the baseboard near the back door that Gerald had meant to fix and never got to. I picked a letter up and read it a third time. Gerald had known something. Gerald had been afraid. Gerald, who had never in 34 years of marriage shown fear of anything except losing me, and he had only told me that once, in a hospital room after my breast cancer scare in 2009, holding both my hands and looking at me like the words were costing him everything he had. I folded the letter. I put the key in the small interior pocket of my purse, where I kept things I did not want to lose. I rinsed my teacup and I went upstairs, and I lay in our bed. My bed. And I stared at the ceiling until the numbers on the clock said 1:17 a.m. I did not sleep much, but I did not cry either. There was something forming in my chest that was not grief and was not quite anger. It was older than both of those. It was the thing that had kept Gerald's grandfather working this land through the Depression. It was the thing that had gotten me through my diagnosis and my surgery and 30 years of hard seasons and one very bad flood and the death of the man I had built my life beside. It was the part of me that knew how to survive. The next morning, I told Daniel and Renee I had a doctor's appointment and I drove to the First Heritage Bank on Sutton Road. The woman at the front desk had kind eyes and the efficient manner of someone who has answered the same questions for 20 years and found a way to mean it every time. I showed her my identification. I showed her the key. I told her my husband had a lockbox. She looked up the account. She looked at me. She said she was sorry for my loss, and the way she said it told me Gerald had been known here, had been a regular presence in a way I had not been aware of. Box 114 was in a small private room in the back. The walls were pale green. There was a single chair. I sat in it and I opened the box. Inside, there was a manila envelope, unsealed, folded once. I opened it and I spread its contents on the small table in front of me. There were documents, bank statements. Not mine, not Gerald's. They were for an LLC I had never heard of, filed in Delaware, with Daniel listed as the registered agent. The statements showed a pattern of transfers that made my hands go still. Over 22 months, money had moved from an operating account associated with the farm's grain contracts into this LLC in amounts just under the reporting threshold. Small enough to seem like noise, large enough, taken together, to represent something close to $80,000. There was also a printed email chain between Daniel and a man named Fowler. I did not know who Fowler was, but the emails discussed a timeline. They discussed the farmland, specifically the 40 acres that ran along the creek on the northern boundary. They discussed value and zoning and a development contact in Nashville. They discussed in terms that tried to be careful but weren't careful enough what would need to happen before the property could be restructured. They discussed me, not by name mostly, by implication, by the phrase once the estate is simplified, by the phrase after the transition. Once, in an email from Fowler, more directly, the mother is the obstacle. That needs to be handled before the end of Q2. I sat in that pale green room for a long time. The last thing in the envelope was a handwritten note in Gerald's handwriting on a torn piece of lined paper, the kind he kept on his desk. It said, "Maggie, if you're reading this, I didn't get to you in time. I'm sorry. The North Field is the reason for all of it. Don't sign anything. Call Thomas Whitfield. He knows everything I know. I love you." I should have said it more. Talvreal was Gerald's attorney. Had been for 30 years, not the young man with the short tie who had come to my house with Daniel. Thomas Whitfield, who had an office above the hardware store in town and who had known us since before Daniel was born. I put everything back in the envelope. I put the envelope in my purse. I drove to Thomas Whitfield's office, and I sat across from him at his desk, and I put the envelope between us, and I said, "Gerald left this for me." Thomas looked at the envelope. He looked at me. He said, "He told me you'd come." It turned out Gerald had spent the last 4 months of his life quietly and methodically building a record. He had noticed the discrepancies in the farm accounts himself. Gerald had always done the books, always preferred to do them by hand, a habit Renee had called old-fashioned and Daniel had called inefficient, and which, it turned out, had saved me. He had taken his concerns to Thomas. He had told Thomas he needed time to verify before he came to me, that he could not accuse his own son without being certain, and that he was not willing to break my heart on a suspicion. He had contacted Dorothy through Thomas. Dorothy, it turned out, was a retired bank examiner, an old friend of Thomas's, sharp and careful and experienced in exactly the kinds of paper trails Daniel and Fowler had thought they were hiding. Gerald had set everything in motion, and then, on a cold January morning, checking the fence line, his heart had given out. Thomas had waited. He had kept the box, kept Dorothy on standby, kept his counsel. He told me he had prayed I would come before Daniel convinced me to sign the estate restructuring papers. The estate papers, Thomas explained, would have transferred management of the farm's trust into a co-ownership structure that would have legally allowed Daniel to initiate a partition sale, a forced sale of the property, over my objection, as long as he could demonstrate the farm was operating at a loss. The LLC transfers, if continued, would have ensured that loss appeared in the books within 2 years. I sat in Thomas's office above the hardware store for 2 hours. When I left, Thomas had already made 3 phone calls. I drove home. Renee was in the kitchen when I came through the door, standing at the counter with a glass of sweet tea, and she smiled at me and asked how my appointment went. And I looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time, and I said it went fine. That evening, Daniel asked again about the estate papers. He said the lawyer needed an answer by the end of the week. He said he was only trying to protect what his father had built. He said it with great sincerity, sitting at the kitchen table where I had sat the night before with Dorothy's letter, and I looked at him, my son, my firstborn, the boy I had held in a hospital room in 1984 and believed, with a certainty I had never questioned, that I would die for, and I said I needed a few more days. He said, of course. He said he understood. He put his hand over mine on the table. I did not pull my hand away. 2 mornings later, there was a knock at the front door at 7:15. I was already dressed. I had barely slept in 3 days, but I was dressed. It was a woman from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and a man from the county sheriff's office. They were polite and thorough, and they had paperwork. They asked to speak with Daniel. Renee came downstairs first. She looked at the people in the doorway, and then she looked at me, and the look she gave me was not surprise. It was something that, if I am honest, looked more like recognition, as if some part of her had always known this road existed and had simply been hoping they would make it past it. Daniel came down 2 minutes later. He stopped on the 3rd step from the bottom when he saw the investigators, and his face went through several things in quick succession. He looked at me last. I did not look away. I will not pretend the rest of it was clean or easy. It was not. There were months of legal proceedings. There was a separate investigation into Fowler, who turned out to have a history with land acquisition schemes in 2 other states. Daniel's lawyer, the real one, not the young man with the short tie, but a serious woman from Nashville who said very little, and billed by the minute, advised him to cooperate. He was charged with breach of fiduciary duty and financial elder abuse, among other things. He took a plea arrangement in November. I did not go to the sentencing hearing. Thomas offered to come with me, and I told him no. I told him I did not need to watch it to know it happened. What I did instead was walk the north field on the morning of the sentencing. The 40 acres along the creek that a man named Fowler had discussed in emails as a commodity, and that Gerald's grandfather had broken with a plow in 1941. The March mud was soft under my boots, and the creek was running high and cold, and the field looked the way it always looks in early spring, rough and dark, and full of the particular kind of potential that doesn't announce itself. I stood there for a while. Renee had left in September. She had packed quietly and efficiently, the way she did most things, and she had taken the items she'd brought into the house and left behind the ones she hadn't, and I had watched her carry boxes to her car, and I had not helped her, and I had not stopped her. And when she drove down the gravel drive, I had stood on the porch until I couldn't see her anymore, and then I had gone inside and made coffee. My daughter, Laura, who lives in Chattanooga with her husband and 3 children, had called me every day since Thomas had first made those phone calls. She had offered to come. She had offered to come many times. I had told her not to, at first, because I was still in the part of it where I needed to be alone to understand what had happened. But in October I called her back, and I said, "Yes, please come." And she came the next day, and we sat on the porch together and talked for a long time. And she cried, and I held her hand, and I let myself cry too, finally, for all of it, for Gerald and for Daniel and for the years of small things I had noticed and catalogued and told myself were nothing. Dorothy came to the farm once, in April, after the worst of the legal proceedings had settled. She drove a sensible blue sedan, and she brought a lemon cake, and she sat at my kitchen table, and we talked for 3 hours. She told me about how she had met Gerald. He had come to Thomas's office asking if Thomas knew anyone with financial forensics experience, someone discreet, someone outside the family circle. Thomas had thought of Dorothy immediately. She told me that Gerald had been very calm when he explained the situation, very methodical. He had laid out everything he knew and everything he suspected and everything he needed to verify. And he had asked for her help, and he had said very plainly that he was not doing this out of anger. He was doing it because he loved his wife, and he was not going to let his son take what she had earned. I thanked her. I told her I did not have adequate words for what she had done. She waved that off the way practical women do. She said Gerald had done the hard part. She said she had just carried something from one place to another. I have thought about that a great deal since then. Carrying something from one place to another. It seems small when you say it that way. But sometimes the distance between those 2 places is everything. I did go to see Daniel eventually. It was not something I had planned. It was a Tuesday in January, a year and 1 week after Gerald had died, and I found myself driving, and I found myself in the parking lot of the facility in Hartsville, and I found myself inside, and then I was sitting across from my son at a table with a corrections officer standing near the door. Daniel had lost weight. He looked younger somehow. which I had not expected. He looked in a way that hurt me in a place I did not have a name for, like the boy in the photographs I keep in the album on the second shelf of the bookcase, the boy on the tire swing, the boy in the Halloween costume, the boy at his high school graduation, looking out at some future he had not yet decided to ruin. He did not speak for a long time after I sat down. I did not speak either. I was not there to make him comfortable. Finally, he said, "Mom." I said, "I know." He said he was sorry. He said it several times, in several different ways, and I listened to each version and I considered it honestly, the way I think you owe anyone, even someone who has wronged you, when they are trying to find the true shape of an apology. I did not tell him I forgave him. I was not there yet, and I was not willing to say it before I meant it. What I told him was the truth. I told him that his father had loved him, that Gerald had spent the last months of his life in real anguish, not over what Daniel had taken, but over what Daniel had become. I told him that Gerald had wanted to come to him first, to give him the chance to stop before it went too far, and that the only reason he hadn't was that he ran out of time. Daniel put his face in his hands. I sat with that for a moment. Then I reached across the table and I put my hand on his arm, not the way you comfort someone, not entirely, but the way you acknowledge someone. The way you say, "I see you. This is real. I am still your mother." Then I drove home. The Northfield was just beginning to thaw when I turned down the gravel drive. In 3 weeks, it would be time to start thinking about spring planting. The creek was still running fast. The old farmhouse sat at the end of the drive the way it always had, white clapboard in the early dark, the porch light on because I had left it on, and I was glad I had. Gerald had repainted that house the summer before he died, in the hottest week of July, and I had teased him about it, and he had laughed and said someone had to do it. I had not understood then what he was doing, what he was always doing. He was making sure the place would hold. I parked the car. I sat in the driveway for a moment with the engine off, listening to the particular silence of 40 acres of Tennessee farmland in late winter. Then I got out and I went inside and I locked the door behind me.